I've seen the photo of you too.
Okay, well, let's kick this thing off. And I think people
Yes.
will join and we'll definitely share the replay. But hello, hello, hello. We are so excited about this. Welcome to So You Want to podcast. I am Leah Steele, and I am incredibly excited to be here talking to you about one of my favorite topics, podcasting, one of my favorite things, podcasting. And I am joined by my partner in crime, who also happens to be my podcast editor, my amazing podcast editor, and partner in this incredible series that we're doing, Shayne Bryan. Shayne, do you want to say hi and give us a little introduction and bio and tell us a little about yourself?
Yes, I guess I started podcasting before podcasting was even a thing. We were uploading interviews to SoundCloud back then. And then suddenly Apple came along and said, we want to start podcasting. And it kind of just sort of crept up on me. Eventually, I started my own podcast, which was Bad Boys Podcast. And through a series of just amazing events, we ended up on TV with it, on the morning show. It ended up going into Apple's New and Noteworthy. Suddenly, 500,000 downloads, and we were completely blown away. And now it actually opened up the door, which we'll talk about as we go through. Opened up the door to a successful radio career.
So good. So I have been podcasting. Oh my gosh.
How long? 2017,
Well,
I think, was it?
No, I think we launched my show in 2020.
But
So
you've been going before that.
Yes, but I think you and I launched in 2020 together. And so I've been going for a year or so before that.
Yeah.
And so my show has undergone several reinventions, as I have over the years.
Yeah.
But I would say that, one of the reasons I'm so excited and one of the reasons why Shayne and I wanted to do this is that my podcast took on a whole new life when I partnered with Shayne. And so I really wanted to share his genius and his expertise with people because I actually DIY'd my podcast in the beginning. I hired somebody who actually wasn't familiar with how to podcast, but I hired somebody full time, and she and I just kind of sorted it out and got it up and running and got it on all the platforms and did it all. I did it all myself. It was incredibly expensive, by the way that I chose to do it in the beginning. And for whatever the year and a half was, I think that I was podcasting prior to Shayne, I spent a lot of money producing my podcast. But if you know me, and for those that don't know me, I've had many, many lifetimes, but for the purpose of this show, I am a podcaster, but I also happen to be a wealth consciousness coach. And I'm someone that's very, very passionate about helping people open up and activate multiple streams of income. And so for me, my podcast was a way to expand my reach, and just from a complete global perspective, reach people that I wasn't already reaching through my social media channels. But it was also something that I always knew I wanted to monetize. So I wanted to open up an additional stream of revenue. And I've been very successful in doing that. But I will say that the success that I had prior to partnering with Shayne has been nothing since this. It's been nothing compared to the success that I've had since partnering with Shayne. And I really think that has a lot to do with, having somebody that can help you and give you feedback, but also just really the quality of your audio, and the quality of the production. And so, that's something that, certainly you can do on your own. And we're going to be talking about that in this series, but it is something also that, you can go out and you can get help with. So I want to be very, very upfront with all of you and let you know that Shayne and I are doing this free 3-day event. And this free 3-day event, there's going to be so much value in this. Yeah. You are going to be very, very clear at the end of this. If you go through the workbook, if you attend all 3 of these sessions, you're going to be very clear on your podcast, on your niche, on what your show's going to be about. You're going to have some really amazing foundation and groundwork to go out there and start your podcast. And we are launching 2 follow-up courses that we will be telling you about probably on the last day of this event, because we really want to just focus on giving you the meat of all this value. And it's going to be a lot, you guys. So make sure you've got a notepad and a pen and be ready to take notes. And we will be sharing notes with you in the Facebook group. And if you're not on Facebook, we will also be sending out emails after every session with the replay and with the notes from the session. So, but we are going to be doing a follow-up course that will be a mini course, that will be a 6-session course that will help you dive even deeper into getting your show up and running. And then we're going to do a full course that's going to go into all of the intricacies now around podcasting, AI, and editing, and all of this stuff. So, stay tuned as we move through this journey, because there are going to be additional resources that are going to help you get your podcast up and running and help you be successful. We also have a podcast network. So if after going through all of this, you're like, you know what? This was awesome, and I'm really clear on my show, but I don't want to do any of the work, we can help you with that as well.
Yeah.
The purpose really of these 3 nights is to just give you, well, depending on where you are in the world, these 3 sessions, we'll call it. The purpose of these 3 sessions is to give you as much value as we possibly can, so that you can be really, really clear on your podcast idea and have enough information to get out there and get started. Shayne, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I do want to say, you can always learn new things. And one of the things that we will talk about is, being a good interviewer. And when we do the full course, we'll do a full section on how to do a good interview. And it's something that I've really been passionate about with the interviewing, because you can do an interview and suddenly it's, it might be fantastic, but it's not doing your business any good. So these are the tips that are really vital that we're going to be sharing. And one thing, talking about, working with you, it's been very inspiring seeing your podcast growing, but more than that, it's been inspiring seeing you building your business off the back of your podcast. And I think, we're probably jumping the gun here because it's one of the reasons why you want to start a podcast, but you've successfully been able to capture, clients and probably you wouldn't even call them clients now, you call them friends, because they get to know you so well through your podcast.
Yeah.
You've built up a massive trust just because they're hearing you. They feel like they know you, and that's one thing that you've done so successfully. So, well done on such an incredible podcast that you've got.
Yeah. And I think, just out the gate, I'll let you know that I've been able to quantify, I've made about $400,000 from my podcast. So that doesn't include all of the sales and that have come through that I haven't been able to quantify. That's just what's measurable. So this is a very viable additional stream of revenue for you. And that's one of the things that I'm really passionate and excited about, is helping people monetize their podcast. So as we move into the expanded courses, we'll be spending more time on that, but let's focus on our content tonight and kick off with, we've got a full packed agenda for you tonight. So I do just want to say, though, before we dive into that this information I really feel is going to be valuable for you, whether your podcast is just an idea right now, or you do have, a bit of a concept, but you need to dial it in, or if you have a podcast and you're in a place where you're like, I think it's time to refresh it, or it's time to reinvent. Listen, I'm the queen of reinvention, and I just did another reinvention on my podcast. So we can definitely speak to that. But I think that regardless of where you are in your podcast journey, you will find some really valuable information here. And I know that I will as well. I can't wait to hear from and learn from Shayne, because I always just, find his experience in this industry so fascinating.
No, thank you.
All right. Well,
Okay, let's get underway. Yes.
all
So,
right.
yeah, I guess the first thing, I mean, just talking about the basics of podcasting. Yeah.
Yeah.
And the first one is like, why should we even start a podcast? I mean, it seems like a lot of work putting a podcast together. But one of the things that if I can just go back into the past, in 2018, there was 500,000 podcasts. So that's it. There was 500,000 podcasts that were actively listened to. 3 months later, it was 550,000. Now, in 2020, something happened. It was called lockdown pretty much everywhere. And that figure rose to over 2 million podcasts. And everyone went, wow, that's a lot of podcasts. 850,000 thousand of them were actively being updated. Like, so,
Think about that for a minute, though. 550 to 2 million. And it was like in the
yeah.
span of a couple of months.
So that was in the span of, that was 2018. And
Yeah.
then by January 2021, it was 2 million. So in 2 years, it had gone up by 1.5 million. Now I'm going to completely blow you away, because in another 18 months, it is now 5 million podcasts worldwide.
Okay, that's the one I was thinking of, because there is if you look at the first few months of the pandemic, there was this astronomical jump
Yes.
in the number of podcasts because people were at home and they were like, well, might as well start a podcast.
And out of those 5 million, there's 71 million episodes. Now, okay, you can look at it and say, oh, gee, that's a lot of podcasts. I don't know whether I want to start a podcast. But the simple fact is that people wouldn't be starting podcasts if it wasn't an important part of their marketing, if it wasn't, something that they're actively using. Now, the big thing about podcasting is that people, they get hooked on podcasts. They start to listen to that same podcast. The statistics show that 80% of the podcast gets listened to. Now, if you're watching a YouTube video on something, you might fast forward it, or you might, or you're listening to, watching something, you'll fast forward it. You mightn't even watch the whole thing. But with a podcast, you're pulling in as much information as you can, 80% of it. And some of these podcasts are massively long. So the average podcast, 20 to 30 minutes, if you have a Joe Rogan, it can be 3 hours long. And if you're a Joe Rogan fan, you are listening to pretty much that whole thing every single day. Now, and this is where a podcast builds that fan base. So Jenna said she's a huge Joe Rogan fan. And you've built up a following, you've built up a fan base that are hanging on your every word. And this is the thing with people like Joe Rogan, like yourself with your podcast that you're building. You're getting active listeners that are wanting to hear more from you. So they're hanging on there. And if you say, look, let's do this, they're there with you. And I'm sure that a lot of your clients and people that you've met have met you through that podcast. So it's a massive opportunity to expand your client base more than just through your social media.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it's interesting because I am a Joe Rogan fan as well. And I do not listen to all of his shows, but I check in on his podcast probably 2 to 3 times a week to see if there's an episode there that I'm interested in.
Yeah.
And I at least consume at least one of his episodes a week. I'm also a huge Andrew Huberman fan. So again, usually a 2.5 to 3 hour podcast, and I check in
Yeah.
on his every week. Once you get that podcast listening bug, like, you've got it. I'm always looking for new podcasts. I'm always looking
Yeah.
at the suggestions that are given to me of new podcasts and checking out new shows. And yeah, I love the medium. I love podcasting as a model. So, but what's the purpose, right? So we talked about like why start a podcast, but what's the purpose?
Okay, so the purpose, obviously, the purpose is part of your marketing, right? It's you're going to be using that podcast to help build your client base. Now, I'm going to prefix that by saying that not everyone starts a podcast because they want to build a client base. And let's look at your podcast in comparison to my podcast. And my podcast went through a metamorphosis. I stopped Bad Boys, just didn't feel right anymore. Just like you changed your podcast. I did it completely different. You've still got the same listeners that have been following through. I completely changed my whole listener base as well and started a brand new podcast that way. So it was really starting from the tin tacks. I didn't start a podcast because I wanted to build clients. I had an end game in mind, and that is I started a podcast because I wanted to move back into radio. And off the back of that podcast, I ended up with a full time. I'm full time here in Launceston. The last couple of days, I've been doing Bundaberg, the other side of the country as well. Doing a show there. I built the Long Way to the Top, which I managed to interview the police. Stuart Copeland from the police. I'm now up for an Australian Commercial Radio Award for that show, because that show was then broadcast right around the country. So you've got two types of main things. You're either building your reputation, right, or you're building your client base. They're the reasons why you're starting a podcast. It's either reputation or your business.
Yeah.
In a nutshell.
And if you are in business, why is a podcast important to your marketing?
A podcast is very much a above the line marketing. So you've got above the line, you've got below the line. So your below the line marketing is going to be things like, your social media marketing, anything that is just ticking along there, that's showing up in your face. And that above the line marketing is used to be traditionally things like TV, radio, press. Gone. Well, not gone. It's still there, but we can't afford it. The average business person starting out can't afford it, but we can afford podcasts. And so we start a podcast because your podcast is your representation of your business. So it is one of your biggest marketing tools that's out there. Because with social media, you have to get in front of a potential client multiple times before they can learn to trust you. How many times do they have to listen to your podcast before they learn to trust you? The average is 3 times. And then then if they can listen to your podcast 3 times in a row, they're hooked for life. They love you because they've built up that trust. So that's why we start a podcast from the marketing perspective. I think that you've got to look at with a podcast. There's 4 main questions that you've got to ask yourself before you start your podcast. The first one is, what I'm going to say, why does that concept matter to me and to my listeners? If it doesn't matter to you and it doesn't matter to your listeners, then you're not going to start it. If you're passionate about it and you want your listeners to experience your passion, then start it. The second thing is it something that you know? Is it something that you can talk about naturally? If it is, then start the podcast. The third one is, can it be expanded on, right, to ensure that your podcast isn't a one-show wonder? If you've got more than just one topic that you can talk about, then fantastic. You can expand on it. Great, go for it. The fourth one is, can the topic that you're talking about generate good conversations? And by that, I mean, can you use what you've spoken about in other areas like social media? Is it going to be of absolute importance to your business and give your business another facet? So these are the vital questions when you're starting a podcast. Why start a podcast? If you can answer each of those 4 questions, then that's why you should start that podcast, because it's important to you.
Amazing. So just FYI, we will, obviously you have your workbook, but we will also put a recap email together that we'll have, because we have several sections tonight where we're posing some questions for you to answer. So don't worry too much about writing it all down. You can, of course, but we will also send out a recap email with the questions, and also, with the schedule of the next call. But yeah, so that'll go out, and it'll also be listed in the Facebook group. So there is a Facebook group. If you're not connected in there, the link to that is in your email that we sent. And so we'll be posting replays and all the resources from the 3-day event in the Facebook group. That's probably the easiest place to just go and get access to everything. But if you're not on Facebook, we will be sending out emails. Okay, so let's talk about what makes a good podcast, Shayne. So, what are the 7 core elements that make a good podcast?
Okay, the first core element is knowing who your audience is. Now, we will cover this in greater detail, but it's it's the age-old thing when you're starting a business. Who is your avatar? We all want to know who the avatar is in our business. The podcast is exactly the same. Who is your listener? If you can actually see your listener. When I started a podcast, Beat Generation, many, many years ago, I wanted that my audience. I actually had a guy in mind that I knew quite well that loved music, loved all of that. He was my audience. That was my key. So that's the first one. Know who your audience is. The second one, know what your subject matter is. There's no point starting a podcast and not having a clue about your subject matter, because people can see right through that, right? And they go, okay, that's just fake, Establish your brand voice, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later on. So that's something that you are great about. So we'll talk about that a little bit later on. The fourth core element is making your show easy to promote. Okay, so there's plenty of tools that you can use out there now. Some incredible AI tools that you can use now to make your show easy to promote. But if whatever your subject matter is, if your subject matter is accessible to people, if it's interesting to people, then it's going to be easy to promote. The fifth one is creating good promotional content. Again, AI, that's the key. The sixth one, and if you can imagine, the Venn diagram, it's the 2 circles or the 3 circles, and the circles are sort of overlapping. If you can find that spot where you've got something that you want to say, and the listener has something that they want to hear, if you can find that spot that covers over both of them, which is what you want to say is what the audience wants to hear, then that's that sweet spot. And it can take a little while when you're doing a podcast. It can take a little while, but when you reach that sweet spot, when people are starting to leave comments on your reviews, or if you're putting it up there and people are going, oh, what about this, or what about that? What a great interview! What a great topic! I really loved hearing what you had to say. That is the sweet spot, and that's then what you should actually talk more of, stick on. Okay. And then the seventh one is good production, because nobody has time to listen to a bad podcast. I don't know about you. If I'm listening I don't care what the topic is. If the podcast is bad, I'm switching it off. So they're the 7
in our ears. So it's extra sensitive about the bad podcast. So if you want Shayne to listen to your podcast, you better make sure your editing's good.
I actually had a couple that sent a podcast to me one day, and they said, what do you think about this? And I went, I could only listen to, I'm going to be really honest, I could listen to 30 seconds of it. I love the content, but I couldn't listen to it. It was so bad. The production was so bad. And, anyway, so we'll talk about that a little bit later on. But yeah, that's the core elements. Yeah.
Awesome.
So it's my turn now to turn the tables on you. And I did talk about the brand voice, establishing your brand voice. And this is where the one thing that I know about Leah and everything that she does is that it is all on brand. So everything she does is on brand. Now, that brand can change from time to time depending on what direction the business is going in, but the podcast follows along with the business brand the whole way. So the question I've got is in your experience, how can you ensure that your podcast reflects the core values and the mission of your brand?
Yeah. So, first, I want to just say that a brand, a personal brand, is so important these days. Like, if you are not out there cultivating and building a personal brand, you are really doing yourself a disservice. Regardless of whether you're just going to be putting out a podcast or you have a brick and mortar business, or even if you're an insurance agent, everyone needs a personal brand. And that personal brand, it's it is the forward representation. It's your frequency, right? It's your frequency that you share out into the world. It is the version of you that the public sees.
Yeah.
And when I say personal brand, I don't mean like, oh, you have to have a color palette and you have to have a certain logo and you have to use certain fonts. That's not what I mean. It's just the consistency with which you show up on your social media and in the world. That version of you that you're presenting to the world. And I believe that it's incredibly important that your personal brand represent your personal values, your core values. Okay. And so it's important to establish that. It's important to know that. Like, who do I want to show up as online? What parts of myself do I want to share? What parts of myself don't I want to share? What do I want people to know about me? I have tended to live my life very publicly. My private life has been pretty public. There are certainly parts of my life that I hold back, that I don't fully share. But for me, I'm like, if you follow me for any given amount of time, you know that I am a no nonsense, no BS, straight shooter. I'm going to call it like I see it. I'm going to be direct. I'm an activator. I want people to make money. I believe in people activating and opening up additional streams of revenue. I have multiple streams of revenue myself. Like, there is when you think of me, and I'm just curious for those of you that are live on the call, I'd love for you guys to just put 3 words that describe me. Put 3 words that describe Leah as a brand in the public, because I just want to see, like, I bet you guys are going to write a lot of the same things there in the chat. But so knowing that, right? Like, who are you? What are your core values? What is your personal mission? What do you care about? What do you want people to know about you? So you take that, right? And those are the core values and mission of your brand, right? And if you have a business brand, I think that there should definitely be a mixing of a personal brand and a business brand if you've got a business brand there. But how you ensure that your podcast then reflects those core values is that you make sure that you're infusing your core values and mission into every single aspect of your podcast, from the topics that you cover and the guests that you invite to the overall tone and messaging of the podcast. So you really want to make sure that the content aligns with your brand's vision and resonates with your target audience.
Okay, but like, what sort of strategies though would you use to integrate into your podcast, and use that in existing brand marketing efforts?
What do you mean?
So, like, what strategies, if you're looking at building your brand and being on brand with your podcast, what strategies can be used to integrate the podcast into your existing brand marketing efforts?
Yeah. I mean, for me, I think I do that quite seamlessly. And I think it's just, it's important to, as you're picking topics for your podcast, think about what are the things that you care about. And this is even when you're trying to figure out what your podcast is going to be about. What are the things that you care about? What are the things that you love to talk about? And then you implement that in your podcast, right?
Mhm.
Certainly. And you talk about that in your podcast, but you also share about that in your social media, which makes it very easy and natural for you to actually be able to promote your podcast episodes within the other work that you're doing. So I feel like there should always be a really good synergy with what you're doing, because that cross promoting is so.
So some of the words that people have used, and it's interesting because that cross promoting, I can see it in your podcast and in your social media and in your business. Wealth integrity, raw, real, passionate, wealth consciousness, authentic, real, honest, conscious, dynamic, wealth, passionate, driven, no sugarcoating, no sugarcoating. And actually, interestingly, the no sugarcoating one, when you are telling it like it is in your podcast, they're the ones that get listened to the most.
Yeah. When I'm yelling at people.
Yeah, yeah. When you're saying, you shouldn't be doing that, it's like doing the whole, Gary Vee thing.
Yeah. So yeah, it's about cross promoting, right? So we're cross promoting across all your marketing channels, your website, your email list, your social media, right? And then you're repurposing your podcast clips as social media content. One of the things that I think is really powerful is to offer exclusive podcast content
Yeah.
and bonuses for the podcast to your existing customers and followers, right? And then obviously, like, I'm a big fan of calls to action regardless. I'm old school, right? So I love a call to action, whether it's in your podcast or it's in your social media, like wherever it is. Like, give instructions to your listeners. They want to be told what to do, right? So forward them to your courses, forward them to your products, forward them to your social media, forward them to your services. Like, and likewise on your social media, do the same to your podcast.
Because but you're forwarding them to your courses, but they already know what they're going to get, because your podcast has delivered exactly what you are as a brand. So they're like, yes, I want more of that.
Yeah.
And so that's why they're jumping on the courses. We're probably already answering this question with that, but how do you measure the impact of your podcast on your brand's overall presence and engagement?
Yeah. Well, I love data, right? Like, I'm a data person. So I love to see data. So I think tracking metrics is really, really important. And like I mentioned to you, like, I can quantify that I have been able to monetize my podcast to $400,000. That is because we've done certain things within my business, like set up links that are only shared on the podcast. Right. So I may be running a course or a program that there's a link that goes out on my social media, but there's a specific link that goes out on my podcast, so I can track that. So metrics and tracking is really, really important. So track your website traffic, track your email list growth, make sure that you have an opt-in that's specifically for your podcast to your email list so that you can track that. Your social media engagement, right? Like, make sure that you're tracking that you're looking at data of that. And there's a couple people on here that work with me privately that know, like, I'm all about, hey, pull up your Facebook analytics. I want to see where you're at. Pull up your LinkedIn analytics. I want to see where you're at. Right. So that way you can actually really, like, know what's happening as a result of your podcast. And that's important to know. And then also, like, monitor your brand awareness. So for me, when I first started my podcast, like, I made a commitment. I was like, I'm podcasting. This is brand awareness. This is brand expansion. This is customer acquisition, but it was a long game. It wasn't like, oh, I immediately want to go sell out a course in 2 months. It was like, I want to build my reputation from podcasting, let people get to know me, and then I'm going to monetize the hell out of this thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
So,
but if you've got your podcast and you're going down that path, if it isn't working, would you reevaluate and change it?
yeah, I mean, I think that, I'm always kind of reevaluating. It's like, is it working? Are people listening? I'm always looking through my episodes being like, okay, well, this one didn't do very well. And it's often the ones that I think are going to do amazing that don't, and the ones that I think were horrible that do great, but we have definitely looked at analytics over the years and said, this is an example. Hey, Leah, your engagement goes through the roof. You get way more listens when you're yelling at people. So what can you get fired up about? Like what can you get on and start yelling at people? And it's like, do the damn thing, get out there and do the damn thing, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah.
yeah, I think that's really important. And I just think, also don't underestimate the power of qualitative feedback from your listeners. If you listen to my podcast, you will hear me saying frequently, hey, email me. I have a podcast email set up, podcast at theleahsteele.com. I want to hear from you. Did you like the episode? Would you rather hear me talk about something else? Like, engage with your listeners and like make sure that you're getting that qualitative feedback.
Yeah.
And comments and reviews are invaluable. So, and this is something I think that we'll speak about in one of the longer courses, but running campaigns, running review campaigns so that you can actually really get a handle on what people are thinking about your podcast is important.
So just so for those, who are new to podcasting, a review campaign, there's a couple of ways you can do that. One is you can, send an email out to people that that are listening to your podcast and go, okay, can you give me a review on it? Or you can say, can you jump on Apple and leave a review, because that facility is there for everybody else to see. And I don't know about you, when I'm going to listen to a podcast, I'll go through the reviews. I'll see what other people are saying about it. And if someone says, "Oh, this is crap," I'm not going to listen to it. I'm going to be like, "Okay, rightio, you've just saved me 2 hours of my life."
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about podcast types.
Yeah.
So, what are the main types of podcast?
Okay, so there's the podcast that you do, which is your solo podcast, which is most of the time you getting on and either talking about a topic that you are passionate about, that you want people to know. You might get on, you might have a ranty rant about something, and then you might change that up a bit, and you might be giving some teaching in that. But it's all a solo podcast. It's you. Everybody gets to know you. They get to know the real Leah, and that's what they love. They're very rarely do you do an interview podcast, and it is one of the types of podcasts. I'm going to throw it to you as to why wouldn't you do an interview podcast? And we've talked about this.
Yeah, it just doesn't work. I mean, I think like I've tried it, and I'm actually getting ready to do an interview on my podcast. So I do them occasionally, but I did spend a season where I was like, okay, I want to do way more interviews. Like I want to do as many interviews as I'm doing solo episodes, and they just didn't perform as well. People were not interested in hearing me interview other people. And I think the other thing that we really recognized and realized was that my podcast is very much an extension of my brand. My podcast is very much my audience getting to know. It's like my personal journal, right? It's my audience really getting to know me. And in an interview, my audience is getting to know someone else. And that wasn't actually why they were coming to my show. And so as a result, those episodes just didn't do as well.
Yeah. And I think this is really important. When you're first starting out, how deciding what type of podcast that you want to do, and what sort of result that you want, because that will impact the type of podcast that you do. So let's talk about, like, we've got the solo podcast, but then we've got an interview podcast. Now, my podcast, Long Way to the Top, it is an interview podcast. I interview musicians. I try to interview high profile musicians. Sometimes they might just be 80s musicians that we've forgotten about, or 70s musicians we've forgotten about. Funnily enough, they still rate really well, because people want to actually hear from the guest. So my focus is the guest. It's not me. Who am I? I'm an interviewer for the guest. But that's the style of show that I've done. It's dangerous. It is dangerous if you are a coach, or if you're in business and in some sort of stream. It's dangerous to have an interview podcast where you're giving them your platform, because you will burn out. Because at the end of the year, when you've done 52 interviews, people will go, okay, but who's Leah? I haven't actually heard anything about Leah. I've heard from all of these people. So it's really important if you're looking at a podcast, make sure that you're focusing on the type of podcast that will benefit your business. The third type of podcast is the multi-host show. So this is where you've got two or three hosts on a show. This is what the Bad Boys was. We were all there. We all talked. We all threw things in. It was funny. It was fun to listen to. That's the multi-show host. Then you've got the extension of that, which is the round table. Now, I don't know whether anyone watches The View or anything like that. I mean, it's like rotating hosts, one main host on the show, and the hosts sort of change every episode.
So I don't know if anyone listens to Patrick Bet David. Like, his show is one of my favorites, and he does the round table show. Like, I don't know if people know.
It's kind of fun.
I love his show. It's funny. Like, the people are funny. He has some regulars that host, but then there's also like guests that come in, and
yeah, very much. Whereas if you've got someone like, I like listening to the Osbournes because I'm a bit of a fan of Ozzy Osbourne.
I love their show. I think
their show's great. That's a multi-host show, and they all give it a go, right? The final one is the audio magazine, and it is a lot of work, but it can be very successful. Now, an example of that, I had a lady that I used to do a podcast for. It was called The Witchcast, and she actually would have it set up into multiple different segments in each show. So she would have a guest, she would have this, she would have that, and she would segment it, and her numbers went through the roof because of it, because people knew that they were getting all different types of content, but it's a lot of work. She got burnt out. So just be mindful that if you're going to do something like that, do it seasonally. Don't do it like forever. Do it seasonally, build up your numbers, then get out. So they're the main types of podcasts. Have a bit of a think about what you're going to do. The other thing I want to say too is, we were talking about podcast quality. When you're doing a podcast, and there's a theory out there, and I think it came from Gary V, that 80%, that's good enough. Get it out there. Podcasts are different. 80% is not good enough. I'm sorry, Gary. 80% will not bring in the audience that you want. You've got to be 100%. So if you do a style of podcast or a type of podcast, or if you don't know your content well enough, and you're only getting to that 80%, then it's not going to be successful. So really think about this. This is that point, especially I see Jenna's making some comments there, which is great, things that she has to think about. If you're starting out with your podcast, really think about these things, because this is that point where you go, right, I'm going to launch a podcast. I'm not saying you can't change it. You can, but you need to give it a good red hot go by really thinking seriously about your style and what you want to do. So, and that brings us
in one of the follow-up courses, we're also going to be talking about podcast burnout, because podcast burnout is real. Like, it is real. And it's something I think that's important that you get prepared for, because, in fact, a couple of the ladies on our network this week were like, oh, I think I'm going to take a break. And I'm like, well, I would encourage you to not do that. And it's very hard. It's hard to not, like, when you get into that place where you're like, oh, I just, like, do people even want to hear about this anymore? I feel like I've been talking about the same thing over and over. Like, there are really specific challenges that come with podcasting. And I know that there's a few people that have actually signed up for this series that are like, that have podcasts, and they're like, I got to figure out the direction that I'm going to go. So just know, like, we'll address it a little bit in this series, but we're going to be talking more about that in our, follow-up courses. I have been through it. I have been through it multiple times. In fact, like, I just took a little bit of a break, and now I'm, have come back like full force, and I'm reinvigorated. And, but I'll tell you, like, taking a break is not the best thing to do. Like, if you can figure out a way to not take a break, especially if you want to keep your show going, like, it's important. So we'll talk more about that. But you did kind of mention something along, you mentioned something about that, and I wanted to actually just
Yeah.
share because I know that we have a few people that have registered for the series that are, trying to figure out a direction for an existing
Yeah.
podcast.
Yeah, and part of that direction, and this is a good segue into what you do, part of that direction is ensuring that you're niching down on your podcast. You can't be everything for everyone. So I'd like to ask you some questions now because you niche down really well. Um, why is it important to define, deeply understand your specific niche audience rather than I just want to be general, just
Well,
appeal to the broad
first
audience?
of all, I have to say that my coaching clients are going to be shocked that I'm even saying this because everyone that works with me knows that when I'm talking about business, I'm typically like, I will often joke and be like, niches are for beaches. Like, I'm like, I don't believe in niches except for in podcasting.
Yeah,
So listen, I really feel like in a podcast, niching down and truly understanding your specific audience is crucial. It is crucial to your success because it allows you to create highly targeted, relevant content that directly addresses their unique needs, their pain points, and their desires. Because if you are not meeting the needs of your audience, you're not going to be successful. If you are not delivering them the content that they want to hear, you're not going to be successful, which means that you can't possibly be speaking to all the people. Like you've
yeah,
got to have a specific audience. A broad general approach just misses the mark, right? Because you won't actually be deeply connecting with your audience.
yeah,
If you're trying to appease everyone and you're trying to be all things to all people, you're not actually delivering that core value message, right? That's part of your brand that we talked about how it's so important. So by narrowing your focus, you actually speak the language of your listeners, right? That helps you build stronger rapport. And it also helps you position yourself as an authority and a go-to resource within that niche, which keeps them coming back to your podcast over and over again.
yeah, yeah. That is beautiful. That's perfect because they get to understand everything that is unique about you. They get to, like you said, you've positioned yourself as an authority and a resource, and they love everything that you're saying because you're speaking directly to them. So what are some of the key benefits of niching down and creating content tailored to like unique needs, interests, challenges of your niche audience?
Yeah. So, I mean, we've been talking about loyalty all along,
Yeah,
right? But like building that loyal, engaged community around your content, it's so important.
yeah,
And then I think the other thing that we do there is we increase the perceived value of us as a host or a coach or a healer or whatever else it is that you do. And it really like solidifies your expertise with your audience, right? So it also, I think, really helps you improve your content quality and the relevance of your content. So, when you know who you're speaking to and you know what you're speaking about, it's very easy to go find topics that are relevant that your audience is going to
mm,
want to hear about. It also really helps with leveraging word of mouth referrals. You will get more people referring people to your podcast because they're like, you'll be talking to your friend about something that you're interested in. And then you're like, oh my gosh, I listened to this podcast. And whenever I tell someone about a podcast, I'm not like, oh, they talk about these 5 things. I'm like, have you listened to this podcast? They podcast about this. It's
yeah,
great. Whatever topic that we're talking about, right? So that word of mouth referral is really important, and niching helps with that. I really feel like for me personally, it's helped me command higher prices for my products and services because, again, I'm positioning myself as the expert in my field,
yeah,
right? And ultimately, it also helps boost conversions and sales
yeah,
because I'm speaking about a specific topic. I am on topic, and I'm positioning myself as an expert. And when I'm asking for the sale, they know it's what you said earlier. They know exactly what they're going to get, right?
yeah,
So a
yeah,
focused niche strategy allows you to stand out amidst the noise, amidst how many 71 billion
71 million podcast
1
episodes.
million podcast episodes. Like, the niche is the strategy that helps you stand out amidst the noise and deeply
Yeah.
connect with your ideal audience.
Yeah, there's as an example of that. You may have heard of a podcaster by the name of John Lee Dumas. Now, he's a very, very clever guy. He started a podcast called Entrepreneurs on Fire, and he focused on and he was doing an interview podcast. I'm going to talk with people who are on fire in their business. He created such a following. He now has a group of followers called Fire Nation, right? He has built up a massive number of following. He can now command thousands of dollars. If you want to be on his podcast, you pay him thousands of dollars because he knows who his audience is. He niched down. He said, I am just going to talk to entrepreneurs who have earned more than, 6 figures a year. And this is it. They can afford me. This is my price. He's killing it. And it's all through niching down. Perfect. Yeah. So we were talking about researching, gaining insights before. How can you effectively research and gain insights into your niche and find out your audience's pain points, their goals, consumption, to create content that really resonates with them?
Yeah. So, I mean, this is like old school stuff, right? But like for me, it's like join online communities and forums where your niche hangs out. Go find where they hang out. Go follow the social media accounts, join the Facebook groups where they are. I think it's really important. Like, we can also like conduct surveys and interviews of our social media audiences, but honestly, like, I think it's so powerful to just go to where your niche is, analyze the comments, look and see what they're commenting on other people's posts, right? Pay attention to the social chatter around your niche. Study your competitors' content. This is so powerful, right? Go find out who else out there who has a podcast that's like the podcast that you want to do. Go to their social media pages. Like, pay attention when they're promoting their podcast. What are the comments underneath that podcast, right? What's resonating with your competitors' content and their audiences? Listen to the language that's being spoken in the niche. Make sure you're familiar with it. Make sure you know what it all means. The lingo, right? The lingo of your niche. The key to me, I think, is really just immersing yourself in their world, in your niche's world, so that you deeply understand their unique mindsets, their challenges, and their desires. Ultimately, like, it's going to be a core value of yours. So you may understand some of it, but the reality is, like, you got to go see what they're talking about, what they want to know about, what's interesting to them. And everybody's got one of these now, right? So you could just, you do your research.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, you can jump on social media now, and what everybody loves and likes and sees, it's all on social media. And if you've got a business and you've got a Facebook business account or an Instagram business account, you can drill down. Even on Google, you can drill down and find out what your audience likes to eat, what they like to drink, where they go. I mean, like, it's scary, the information you can know. So do your research on that. Find it. Use social media. It's there, scarily enough, but it's there. It tracks your every move.
Yeah, exactly. Once you start searching your niche on Instagram, trust me, you're going to get served all the content. You're going to know.
Exactly. Now, we were talking about branding before, and I want to just change it over and talk about a slightly different topic. And it's something that we have to think about when we're doing a podcast, and it is audio branding. So what does your podcast sound like? Now, I'm not talking about what music do you have in your podcast or anything like that, but what, I guess, as if you're an aspiring podcaster or someone who wants to get wants to rebrand, you need to get clear on the sound of your podcast brand.
Yeah.
So,
like, we were just talking about how my brand is often shouting.
yes, it's a shouty shout brand. Okay. So how would you describe the overall vibe, energy, personality that you want your podcast to embody?
So these are the questions actually. So these are the three questions that we want you guys to answer, right?
Yeah, right.
Like this is like for you, how do you get clear on the sound of your podcast brand, right?
Yeah.
So we want you to ask yourself three questions. And again, we're going to send you these questions out so that you have them. But like the first question is, how would you describe the overall vibe, energy, and personality you want your podcast to embody? Like for me, personally, I want my podcast to be fun. Like, I don't want anybody coming and like getting depressed on my podcast. So I'm always going to be cracking jokes throughout it. Even if I'm talking about heavy content, like heavy material in the podcast, I'm going to be making a joke, right? I'm going to be laughing at myself. I'm going to not be taking myself too seriously. And it is going to be really direct. My podcast is high energy, right? Like it is not calm. It is not mellow. Like it's high energy. But for you, like maybe you want your podcast to have this warm, authentic, want it to feel like engaging, and you want it to be like a fun conversation with a wise best friend that really gets you. So your energy is going to be upbeat, not over the top, and the personality will be like knowledgeable yet relatable with a good balance of professionalism and humor, which will keep things light and enjoyable. Like so you can kind of see like this is like, what's the overall vibe? What's the energy? What's the frequency and personality you want your podcast to embody, right?
You completely described my podcast.
Yeah. So like, and obviously like that's going to be different depending upon what type of podcast you choose.
Yeah.
So then what kind of language, tone, and communication style will you use to connect with your niche audience? Well, I used to curse a lot in mine, right? Very direct. Yeah. I yell. I don't curse so much anymore. Still do occasionally. But my communication style is very direct. It is very to the point, right? I'm just like I'm talking to you guys right now. This is very much what my podcast sounds like. So I use very straightforward and conversational language, right? You may be like, oh, your niche might have a lot of lingo. It might have a lot of jargon, right? And so that might be part of your podcast. Or you might be like, I want to stay away from that. I don't want that in my podcast, right? You might want your tone to be like positive and encouraging, but real and honest, right? That might be something. For me, we mentioned before, I'm like, no sugarcoating. I'm just going to tell you like it is, right? But you might be like, and for me, it's like, I want people to feel like they can trust me because they know I'm going to tell the truth, right? But I'm also empathetic, and I want them to feel like I'm knowledgeable. I want them to feel like I have wisdom. So like that they can trust me, that I'm a trusted advisor, because ultimately I want them to buy from me, and they have to trust me in order to buy from me. So that's why like that. So the first one's kind of like vibe, energy, frequency, personality, right? Yeah. The second question is like language, tone, and communication style. And then the third one is how will the sound and feel of your podcast reinforce your brand's core values and unique positioning? Okay. So again, my authentic, like real direct sound of my podcast aligns with my brand's core values of honesty, authenticity, transparency, and directness, right? Yeah. So you get the same feeling, you get the same tone, regardless of whether you're signing up for one of my courses, or you're doing a masterclass with me, or you're watching a live stream of mine on Instagram, or you're listening to my podcast. Like it's all very cohesive, and that's really important, right? And so what that also helps you do is it helps you reinforce your unique positioning as a go-to resource, right? For your niche. Like, for me, it's like actionable, get out there, take action, do the thing, right? That's what I'm trying to get my audience to, like, go out. You can do this, empower them. You can make money, like you can have a real life, live a real life, and still go out and go after and achieve your goals. So those three questions, we're going to share them with you so that you can actually spend some time answering them.
And I think it's interesting hearing that, because in complete contrast to that, my podcast is more along the line of, I want my audience to get to know the person that I'm speaking to And so I speak to them as a friend, as someone that's just sitting there having a casual conversation. This guy is like a well-known musician, someone like Stuart Copeland. We were sitting there, we were joking. He's with the Police. He's talking about handing his guitar to the Edge. And it's like, or it wasn't him handing the guitar; it was one of the band members. But it was funny. It was engaging. I was asking questions that most people have never heard, and things that maybe they wanted to hear. But my brand, my sound brand was one of I want to get to know this person. I want my listener to get to know this person intimately. So
Yeah.
sitting back, casual conversation, and
Yeah.
it served me well. Yeah. So really think about what your audio brand sounds like, and maybe tomorrow night, I think it'd be good to hear, or even in the Facebook group, answer those questions.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Okay,
Yeah.
so
Cool.
we are getting to our last section of the night, and then we're actually going to go through the workbook a little bit with you guys, and we can answer questions as well for those of you that are on live if you've got questions about the workbook. But let's talk a little bit about how they figure out what kind of podcast is right for them.
Yeah.
So, what questions should they be thinking about when they're considering the style of show?
Yeah. So what is the podcast about? So when you're going through this, really start to think about, what am I going to talk about? What is my ongoing theme? Not just the theme of the week, but my ongoing theme. And then once I've worked out my ongoing theme, will I have the same segments every week? Am I going to have a different, like you've got your overall theme, but am I going to have different sub themes each week? Which is what you do. You've got your overall theme, which is about wealth, right? It's about not just wealth, but health. Then you've got your individual themes each week, or each episode,
Yeah.
which you will completely nail. How many segments are you going to be doing? How many shows are you going to be doing each week? If you are doing segments, which can be a very interesting way of doing it, how are you going to transition between those segments? Talking, sound effect. How frequently are you going to publish your podcast? How long are the podcast episodes going to be? One thing that I should say with that is, with the length of your podcast, I don't get too fixated on the length of it. If I've delivered the message, and like yourself, I pick up on energy. If I'm sitting there and listening to or talking with someone in an interview, I can feel the point when the interview is over. It's just like, we've said everything that we need to say. We don't need to say any more. Great. What a great chat. Thanks for being on the show. Wrapping it up. And I think if you're listening to yourself and you're listening to them, then you'll know how long your podcast is going to be, and the audience is going to love it because it's just the right length.
Yeah.
So there's some of the things you can see.
I don't think you need to get hung up, right? Because for me, it's like sometimes my episodes are 50 minutes long, sometimes they're 20 minutes long. And I think like what you said is so true. It's like, what is the like, when the message has landed and the message is there, it's like, yep, cool, right? I'll just speak to this a little bit because, so my podcast, which originally started out as the Wealth Witch podcast, I retired that brand in September. I was burned out on that show. I was ready to move in a new direction. And so in the fall of 2022,
Yes,
yeah,
2022. Yep.
yeah, fall of 2022, I shifted the podcast to House of Wealth.
Yeah.
And so House of Wealth for me was because I felt like I was being a little pigeonholed with the Wealth Witch, and I wanted to talk about a broader subject matter. I really wanted to talk about wealth in all areas of our life. And so I was like, oh, House of Wealth feels so good because it's like a house, we have different rooms in the house, and we have different areas of wealth, different wealth priorities in our life that are important. So whether it's wealth in our relationships, whether like wealth in our finances, obviously is one, wealth in health, which has become really important to me and increasingly important over the years, or over the time since I relaunched the podcast as House of Wealth. So I've got this overarching theme, but I've got then all my rooms of wealth that I can talk about. So I have all this different subject matter, but I'm still very niched down because people are coming to me. I'm a holistic wealth strategist. That's my name in the online space. I talk about holistic wealth as a means to like looking at wealth in all areas of our life, and that it is our divine birthright to be wealthy in all areas of our life. So that is the theme of my podcast. And then I'm like, okay, well, I'm doing this road to 50 thing where like I'm pushing myself to be in the best physical, mental, and physical health of my life in 2 years when I turn 50. And we started this a year ago. So I have a segment on my podcast called Road to 50, and it's more focused on the physical wealth side, right? So if people see, oh, it's a Road to 50 episode, they're going to know that's about Leah's journey of not drinking alcohol anymore. It's her journey of carnivore. It's her journey of how those things have impacted her mental health. It's her, how she's working out, how she's managing her physical body, what peptides is she taking. Like I'm going to do some interviews with some doctors in that segment. So, like some people might not be interested in that, right? But again, it's like my segment is niching within my niche even. It's even breaking it down even more so that my audience knows exactly what I'm going to be talking about.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting too that Jenna has actually said that she picks episode lengths that relate to what she's doing at the time. And that's actually really true. If you don't worry about whether your podcast is 10 minutes long or whether it's half an hour long, right? You're going to end up people are still going to listen to your podcast during a time that actually matches their what they're doing, driving or walking or cleaning or or getting things ready. So don't worry about the length of it. Make sure that you're really niching down, and as Leah said, niching within the niche as well, and really think carefully about what your podcast is going to be about and what your theme is going to be about. So these are things when we're considering starting your show and the type of show. So again, we're going to put those questions in the Facebook group. Answer those questions, and even it's not us evaluating your answers. It's you thinking about the style of show that you're going to have.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so shall we go through any questions for those of you that are watching live? Any questions on anything that we've covered? I know that was a lot, but it really lays a good foundation for the stuff that we're going to cover in the next 2 sessions. And it really kind of goes over part 1 and part 2 of your workbook as well, which we're going to go through right now. But let us know if you have any questions before we move on to workbook review.
I'm going to bring up right now, so it's in front of me.
Okay, so part 1 of the workbook is all about uncovering your unique podcast concept and core message. And I feel like this is really straightforward. This workbook, like we designed it because we really wanted you to just be able to like get in there. But this is that idea of like, who are you, right?
Yeah.
What's the concept? What's the show going to be about? And what's the core message going to be about? So the first thing is to begin to think about what topics and areas are you most passionate about sharing through your podcast. Make a list of those things. So here's the thing I'm going to tell you. If you decide to do a show on something that you're just kind of interested in, burnout's going to hit real fast and that show is not going to be successful. Like you need to pick a topic that it's like the thing that your family is like, will you please shut up about that? Like, I'm so tired of hearing about that. I'm so tired of hearing you talk about that. Like that's what your podcast needs to be about.
Yeah. Like I love music. I talk about music all the time. It's my passion. So of course I'm going to talk to musicians, I mean, that's my passion. You love what you do. You're living what you do. You're going through the processes. So you're going to talk about that and say, hey, guess what I did today? Oh, I've gone carnivore. Great. This is the process, and people are following your journey through that.
Yeah. Then question 2 is, what is the core message or transformation you want your listeners to experience? So I think this is really important because I started my podcast because I wanted to reach more people, but it's always been about helping people embody my catchphrase, which is, it's your
Yeah.
divine wealthy right to be wealthy in all areas of your life, and you're so worthy and you're so deserving. Like,
Yeah.
that is what I want them to walk away with, right? And now, even more, it's like I want them to experience holistic wealth,
Yeah.
right? I want them to recognize and realize that wealth is more than just money or finances in your bank account, right? I want them to have a holistic life experience. So I'm very clear on the transformation I want to help them have, and the experience I want them to have from listening to my podcast.
Yeah, yeah. And look, the core message may not be, you might be an avid true crime listener. You might go, I want my core message to be about, this particular true crime case. If that's what your passion is, then that's what you do. But it's got to be the core message. It's you have to be able to deliver this. And I think that's the thing that most people go, oh, hang on a sec, maybe I can't deliver it.
Yeah.
Maybe I can't. So pick something you can deliver.
Yeah. I mean, so I love true crime podcasts, actually. Like, they're the only, like, I kind of consider those like my fiction books,
Yeah.
even though it's true crime. But like, everything else I listen to is like politics, or, in my niche, or, yeah, I mean, I listen to lots of stuff, but true crime is like, I love true crime. But what do you walk away? What do I walk away with? Like, what is the experience that, like, I have from listening to true crime? I think it's fascinating. I get to get inside the head of a
Yeah.
criminal, or I get to hear a story and like try to figure it out. I remember like a couple years ago, I binged listened to Son of a Hitman. Have
Yeah.
you ever
Right.
listened to that?
Yes. Yes.
So good. Like, Son of a Hitman is about Woody Harrelson's dad, who was a hitman, who was sent to prison for killing a federal judge. This is Woody Harrelson, right?
Yeah.
And so this guy did this podcast on it, and he partnered with Woody Harrelson's brother on this podcast. And it was like 8 episodes or something, but I binged this thing. I was like, oh, this is so fascinating. Like, I was so fascinated by it. And it, like, this core message was, ultimately, did Woody Harrelson's dad actually kill this judge? Yes, he was a hitman, but it was a mystery. Like, and it kind of left you
Yeah.
hanging because you never really knew. Like, he killed a bunch of other people, but did he actually commit the crime that he went to prison for? And it hooked me, and it's like, they knew that was the point. The point was to leave people guessing,
Yeah.
like, did he actually commit this crime, right?
Yes.
They had a very clear experience they wanted the listener to have, and they set it up in every single episode.
Yeah. I'm actually. I'll let you know now. I'm actually in the middle of producing a true crime podcast for the gun runner, the Norwegian gun runner that was involved in the biggest murder case in Norway. It was the Orderud case, massive case. This guy supplied the guns. He is now completely reformed and is helping people get through that process. But it's a fascinating situation because he's going through and he's asking that question. Was it my fault? Was it my fault that this all happened, because I supplied those guns? So yeah, it's there's a lot of work involved, but I'll tell you what, it's if you decide to go down that path with podcasting, it's a very rewarding experience as well. So moving along, how can you put a fresh spin on your topic to stand out from other shows? So we want you to really think about and brainstorm the different angles. Let's go back to the fact that there are 72 million episodes out there. Okay. Even with all of those episodes, you can come up with something that is unique, your unique angle.
Yeah, 100%. And it's so important. Like, it's so important to stand out, and it's like, what is the fresh spin?
Yeah.
It's okay if other people have the same topic. It's okay. Like, that's cool. I listen to lots of podcasts that are a similar vein, but they
Yeah.
each have something unique about them that I like.
Yes.
So it's like, find your uniqueness, your unique voice within the niche, right?
Yes. Exactly. The next one, craft a 1 to 2 sentence description of your overall podcast concept that feels authentic to you. So this is basically your mission statement. This is you describing what your podcast is going to be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then what's your personal story or journey that ties into the podcast concept? This is so important. And honestly, like, don't pick a topic that you can't personally relate to. Don't pick a topic that either you're not, I mean, like if you're doing a true crime podcast, I'm not saying, don't do a true crime podcast if you're not a murderer or you haven't committed a crime, but like,
And don't go and commit a crime just so you can do a true crime podcast.
yeah. But why do you love it, right? What's the personal story for you? Like, I could totally see myself doing a true crime podcast because I love it. Like, I think it's so fascinating. Like, I am the person that watches all those Netflix documentaries, the true crime stuff. Like, you know what I mean? So I enjoy it, and I would enjoy the process of diving into it because it's fascinating for me, right? But if you're doing a solo podcast, for example, right? What's your personal story? Like, I have a personal story. I have made and lost millions of dollars multiple times. I have made all the mistakes when it comes to wealth. I have, you know what I mean? Like, I'm personally invested in this journey and in this story. And I'm also really passionate about helping people not repeat my mistakes. Yes. So what's your personal story and journey that ties into your podcast concept?
Yeah. Yeah. And then the extension from that is, how can you weave your personality and life experiences into the show?
Yeah.
So that's a real 2-part question. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and then part 2 of the workbook is defining your ideal listener's interests, pain points, and desires. So this is your niche, right? This is like the stuff that we talked about. So this part of the workbook is really going to help you dial in the niche. And again, like I will probably go in and add like just some, at some point I'll rework the whole workbook, but I think for now I'll just do an actual addendum, an add-on. And then we'll put that in the email, and we'll also, and I'll send that out tomorrow morning, you guys, just so you know, because it's quite late here. So as soon as we're done, I'll go to bed. And then tomorrow morning, I'll get up and I'll send out all the questions to you in email and put it in the Facebook group. But dive into this workbook if you haven't in the meantime, right? Yeah. So as you're doing the niche, so what do? You describe your ideal listeners' demographics, interests, and lifestyle. That's the first point. Who are you speaking to? What are their demographics? How old are they? Are they a woman? Are they a soccer mom? I'm
going to take it one step further. I think you should name them. Give them a name. Like literally. So, because the thing is, if you know who they are and you've actually named them, when you're doing your show, you've got them in your mind. You know exactly who you're talking to. As crazy as it sounds, it works.
Yeah. And then, what are their biggest struggles? What are their fears? What are their pain points? What are the pain points that are related to your topic? What are their deepest desires, their hopes, their motivations? I can tell you that there is an incredible AI tool. And if you want to know more about this, you can reach out to me, called Genius AI. And I actually did just recently a deep dive into my client avatar for my show in Genius AI. And I went in and asked these questions in relation to my show. And the stuff that came back was so good. And it's helping me so much with my show. So if you're interested in Genius AI, you can definitely reach out to me and I can connect you in there. It's a unique piece of AI software. It's a unique tool that actually really helps. And we'll put this in resources as well for everyone. But it can help you get really clear on this and give you ideas, like, especially if you're like, you have a little bit of an idea, but you need a deeper dive. Like, these are the places where AI is really amazing, and we really should be leveraging it and using it to help us dive deeper into our message, to help us hone in our message.
Yeah. And not shying away from it. It's not something to be scared about. It's a massive tool. Brilliant tool. The other question is, how can your podcast content help solve their problems, satisfy their cravings?
Their true crime cravings.
Yeah. But it's like, interestingly, the moment that I did an interview, moment I do an interview with any artist, I will reach out through one of the fan clubs, right? And they're like, great, there's a new podcast about my favorite artist, and they'll share it into their fan club groups because they've got a craving about that particular artist. So every single one is unique. So I think if you can present something that will satisfy their cravings, they will just eat it up. What are some of the biggest myths or misconceptions your ideal listener may have about your topic? That's a really important one because it's kind of like you're bringing in the negative, and exposing those myths right from the get-go.
Yeah, it gives you topics to talk about, and again, it makes you the authority and the expert, right?
Yeah.
If you're
Yeah.
like straight out the gate, you start sharing with them, you may have heard that this is true. It's not. Here's why, right? Like that, again, it makes you the authority and the expert.
Yeah. And last question in part 2, what are your biggest objections that may be stopping them from taking action? So I think those two parts are essential before you get to the point of what's the podcast name, what's my tagline, that sort of stuff. You need to get really clear on these particular areas before anything else.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was just going to pull up. I thought I had my sheet open, but I didn't. I closed everything to make sure that everything was running smoothly. But I want to just give a little preview of what we're going to be talking about tomorrow night. So let me go find
There's
our.
just too many windows that you've got
I know.
to
Too many windows, too many documents.
I need more screens in my life.
I do need more screens in my life. I miss having I would always have my big screen, and then I don't have my big screen set up here yet. I need to get that done. Okay, where is our? Here we go.
Yeah.
Okay, so in tomorrow's session, we are going to be diving into the recording process.
Yep.
And what to look out for, content creation.
Yep.
Planning your interview podcast.
Yep.
Right?
All the different pros and cons of each of the different types of content.
Yep.
What each of the different types of content are for. Repurposing content, that's something that I'm really looking forward to because you can do so much, especially with AI now.
Yeah. And then just like what you need to plan an interview podcast, right? Like the expectations, of being really clear with the person that you're interviewing. Like, what are your expectations of them, right? So we're going to talk about that, where to find guests, how to brief a guest, the importance of briefing a guest correctly, like why you would want to do that. We're going to be talking about marketing and cross promotion and tips and tricks for beginners when it comes to interviewing.
Yeah, and I'm going to share a story tomorrow night that will blow you away about an interviewer that just was not listening to his guest at all during the interview, and he missed possibly the biggest scoop of his life. So that'll be an interesting conversation. I use this story all the time. It's just, it blows me away whenever I hear it. So
I do want to say, like, even if you're thinking, oh, I think I want to do a solo podcast, tomorrow night's going to be really important for you because I will tell you that one of the ways that I do break up the podcast burnout is by doing interviews once in a while. So it's very important to know how to do a good interview because chances are, even if you're doing a solo podcast, you're going to want to be doing interviews once in a while.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's not a steadfast rule. It's just, break it up with other things if so that it doesn't become the main focus and suddenly you become burnt out because you've done too many interviews. So this has been fantastic.
We're so excited for tomorrow. We hope that you found value in the content tonight. We will open it up. Does anyone have any questions for us about what we've covered tonight?
No, they're just saying it's been fabulous. Look, there's been so much information in this. If you need to go back and rewatch the whole chat, I think it's probably worthwhile as well, especially when you're going through the workbook, just to get a bit of clarity.
Yeah, absolutely. We will. I think my team will probably get the recording up in the Facebook group tonight, so the replay will be up there, and then we'll work on getting all the new questions out to you and the notes from the session tonight. And we will see you tomorrow, same bat time, same bat channel.
Yes.
And if there are people that you think are, excited about or want to know more about podcasting, now that you've been here and you've watched the show, I'm going to drop the link in the chat. You could just share that link with them. Otherwise, you can have them personally message me, or you can message me, and we'll make sure to get them connected in so that they can take advantage of watching this incredible free 3-day event. And yeah, we'll see you tomorrow.